Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I especially want to thank Steve Graham and Ramala Sanyal for the invitation and Anne Fry for managing all aspects of this visit. I also want to acknowledge the many colleagues, friends, and former students who are here in this wonderful Northern England setting. My talk today is titled Welding Cities Towards a Theory of Global Urbanism. This is an ambitious title for, of course, it poses the question of whether or not a theory of global urbanism is indeed possible. And if so, do I want to suggest to you that I'm one of the interlocutors of such a theory? Surely not. And yet today I do want to take up the task of what it means to produce an urban theory that is attentive to the realities of global urbanism. What is at stake in such a task is much more than the cataloguing and recording of the diversity and heterogeneity of urbanisms around the world. What is at stake is indeed theory. Let me explain. In my previous work, I have argued, inspired by Jenny Robinson, that it is time to rethink the geography of authoritative knowledge that attends our study of cities. That authoritative knowledge, which we designate as theory, operates through what Robinson has called the regulating fiction of the first world global city. Most important, such theory remains closely yoked to the urban experience of Euro-America and is thus inevitably parochial. While parochial, it circulates as universal knowledge. In this context, the urbanism of the global south is seen at best as interesting ethnographic vignette. As Pengqiu notes, we need to understand more fully the schema through which the subject of universal knowledge becomes isomorphic with the West and all other regions become consigned to particularity. With this in mind, in my work, I have called for new geographies of theory, those that take into account seriously the urban experience of the global south. I believe that an urban theory produced in the crucible of southern cities can transform the study of all cities, including those in the global north. It is thus that Steve Pyle has called for a provincializing of Western cities. I take that to mean that postcolonial theory, especially lines of postcolonial theory that have sought to demonstrate the parochial character of universal knowledge claims, can in fact shed light on the constitution of Western cities. Pyle designates Western cities as a strange case, thereby provincializing the seemingly universal. It should be obvious by now that the task of producing new geographies of theory has important implications for planning practice as well. In a recent intervention, Vanessa Watson argues, I quote, that the past dominance of the global north in shaping planning theory in practice has limited the ability of urban planning to respond to growing problems of poverty, inequality, informality, rapid urbanization, and spatial fragmentation. For Watson, this now dominant urban condition requires the planning take up the charge of what she calls seeing from the south. Now, the global south is, of course, not just in the south. It is everywhere, in border neighborhoods, in military urbanism, in ghettos, in foreclosed suburbs. Can third worlding the West make possible the imagining of alternative urban futures? It is a question to which I will return later in today's talk. But let me first take up the task of a theory of global urbanism. In our recent co-edited book, Welding Cities, Asian Experiments and the Art of Being Global, Iwa Ong and I turned to the concept of welding to trace a theory of global urbanism. Seeking to move beyond the established map of global cities, we present cities of the emergent world as welding cities. Not reducible to the command and control nodes of global capitalism, the welding city is a milieu of intervention. It is a claim to instantiate some vision of the world in formation. Bold experiments, welding cities are inherently unstable, inevitably subject to intense contestation, and always incomplete. It is important to note that welding practices are not simply the domain of urban and transnational elites, And Colin McFarlane's work here on translocal assemblages speaks to the diverse character, perhaps, of worlding. Or, for example, in his work on African cities, Abdul Malik Simone highlights how practices of worlding are set into motion through the state of being cast out into the world. For Simone, worlding from below involves circuits of migration, resource evacuation, and commodity exchange. At the start of the urban century, one in which much of the urban growth will take place in the global south, we hope to foreground these worlding cities as subjects of history. I use that phrase very carefully, and it refers to the important post-colonial treatise, Provincializing Europe, by Dipesh Chakraborty. In that text, Chakraborty notes that European historicist thought has often consigned non-Western nations to the waiting room of history. He writes, as if we were all headed for the same destination, but some people were to arrive earlier than others. In the maps of urban theory, cities of the global south have for too long been consigned to the waiting room of history, and it is time to rethink this. Chakraborty's work also points to a second meaning to the term worlding. As I've already stated, I'm interested in how cities are worlded in geographies of knowledge. In particular, I'm interested in how postcolonial theory can make possible a new and different approach to global metropolitan studies. Now, I should clarify what I mean by the postcolonial. I do not mean the urban environments that are usually designated as postcolonial cities, but instead I mean the postcolonial as a critical deconstructive methodology, one that draws attention to worlding practices. For example, in a seminal essay, postcolonial theorist Gayatri Spivak draws attention to what she calls the worlding of what is now called the Third World. Examining the empire of the literary discipline, Spivak shows how the Third World is taken up as distant cultures, exploited, but with rich intact literary heritages waiting to be recovered, interpreted, and curricularized in English translation. At the same time, she notes, a disavowal of worlding connections in the literatures of European colonizing cultures, what she calls a sanctioned ignorance of imperialism. It is this itinerary of recognition or misrecognition that Spivak urges us to study. And that has been my primary inspiration in urban theory. So let us consider how cities of the global south have been worlded in the itineraries of urban theory. Following Robinson, we can note that the cities of the global south have been scripted through the frame of developmentalism. Defined as megacities, as big but powerless, they exist under the sign of underdevelopment. They are the sites at which capital accumulation and democratic governance are seen to happen under special circumstances. In apocalyptic narratives such as that of Mike Davis, they constitute the planet of slums with its twilight struggles. More recently, a new type of worlding has sought to reposition megacities as spaces of survival and resilience. In my work, I've loosely designated this as subaltern urbanism, for it is a genre of representation that seeks to recover subaltern spaces as subjects of history. Of particular interest is the metonymic space of the megacity, the Third World slum. If Mike Davis presents the slum as a warehousing of surplus humanity, then the narratives of subaltern urbanism present the slum as places of enterprise and economic activity. For example, as a response to the film Slumdog Millionaire, which was reputed to be set in Dharavi, Asia's largest and perhaps most famous slum, urban advocacy groups in India crafted an alternative frame of the slum as a vibrant global economy. In a New York Times op-ed, Mumbai-based Pukar, an advocacy group, wrote, "Dharavi is the most active and lively part of an industrious city. People have learned to respond in creative ways to the indifference of the state. Dharavi is all about such resourcefulness. Over 60 years ago, it started off as a small village in the marshlands and grew, with no government support, to become $1 million economic miracle. no master plan, no urban design, no zoning ordinance, no construction law, or expert knowledge can claim any stake in the prosperity of Dharavi. What is being asserted here is what Barkha Dutt, India's most famous journalist, calls the Jugaad spirit that is so typical of India. Jugaad, she notes, is originally the word for a marvelous invention, not really this is also an example of Jugaad, but in India, Jugaad is a hybrid automotive that welds the body of a jeep with the engine of a water pump and looks like a tractor. In India, that term is used as a shorthand for spunkiness, as a make-do attitude, making do under conditions of great resource constraint. And in fact, there is today a whole exhibitionary complex of architects and urban designers organized around the theme of Jugaad urbanism. And here, Ramola Sanyal's work on slum tourism draws attention, critical attention, to these practices of exhibition. Now, this sort of valorizing of Jugaad urbanism is all around us. So, for example, star architect Rem Koolhaas interprets the urbanism of Lagos as a culture of make-do. As part of Harvard's project on the city, Koolhaas is taken with the inventiveness of the residents of Lagos, and he sees their responses, I quote, as generating ingenious critical alternative systems, a type of self-organization producing intense emancipatory zones. Or working in the context of the Middle East, sociologist Asif Bayat argues that informal life, characterized by flexibility, pragmatism, negotiation, is a habitus of the dispossessed. This, for him, is the global urban future. Now, these ideas bear striking resemblance to the sketch of post-capitalism put forward by geographers Gibson Graham, their celebration of the exciting proliferation of projects of economic autonomy and experimentation. Gibson Graham make a case for the performing of new economic worlds, what they call an ontology of economic difference, and they in fact urge us as scholars to make these alternative economic worlds more real and credible. I'm highly sympathetic to these renditions of third world urbanism, those that place the megacity and the slum at the very heart of the making of global urban futures. And I see this approach as an important correction to the silences of urban theory, to the sanctioned ignorance that has repeatedly ignored the urbanism that is the life and livelihood of much of the world's humanity. But I have two concerns. First, there's an uncanny convergence between the utopian schemes of the left, for example, post-capitalism, and schemes of economic libertarianism. So take, for example, Hernando de Soto, who presents the third world slum as a people's economy populated by heroic entrepreneurs. For de Soto, such shadow economies are rich in assets, albeit in the defective form of dead capital. The mystery of capital for him is how such assets can be transformed into liquid capital, thereby unleashing new frontiers of capital accumulation. Much of my recent work has been around this conversion of poverty into capital, and it requires of us constant vigilance in how we as scholars conceptualize economies of poverty. Second, I think it's crucial that we consider that the forms of southern urbanism cannot be fully contained within the metonymic categories of the slum or the megacity. In other words, how can we produce a different worlding of the cities of the global south and thereby also provincialize global urbanism? With that in mind, I want to turn to some of the worlding practices that hold my attention. I'm going to highlight three. The making of the Indian world-class city, and you'll see that I spend more time on this than on the other two, but also global peripheries as sites of worlding, and third worlding the West. Let me start with the making of the Indian world-class city, which has been something that I've been studying for well over a decade. The Indian world-class city must be understood as a claim to what has been called the Asian century. But it must also be understood as a mass dream. I borrow this term from Suketu Mehta, who has argued that just as cinema is a mass dream of the audience, Mumbai is a mass dream of the peoples of South Asia. So I'm interested in the world-class city as a mass dream. In India, the turn of the century has been marked by a violent expansion of the frontier of urbanization, a making of the Indian world-class city through the smashing of the homes and livelihoods of the urban poor. For example, in 2004-2005, Mumbai city authorities sought to implement their Vision Mumbai plan to the eviction of 300,000 slum dwellers in a matter of weeks, what came to be known as the Indian tsunami. In Delhi, there's been a speeding up of slum clearance. You see here a before and an after, a quite literal erasure of the urban poor from landscapes, and slum clearance authorized and legitimized by a series of judicial rulings issued by the Delhi High Court. In Kolkata, the left-front government has promoted the rapid urbanization of the city's rural eastern periphery through the development of new towns. Underwritten by public-private partnerships, these urban communities are formed through the erasure of the land and livelihood claims of squatters and sharecroppers, and through the enclosure of wetlands, fisheries, and other commons. Nationwide, India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry has facilitated the formation of special economic zones. The freeing up of land for SEZs have required tremendous violence on the part of the state, land grabs by the state, which in turn has been met by quite fierce contestation. Such urbanization is underwritten by an activist state that has actively sought to deregulate space. And the state activism has involved at least 3 types of urban interventions: slum evictions, special economic zones, and peri-urban new towns. If we are to designate this type of activist state as neoliberal, then let me suggest to you that neoliberalism in India must be understood as homegrown, as a conjuncture mediated by state practices, diasporic investment, middle-class associational life, and even the self-crafted identities of the Indian urban poor. I'm very interested in the normative aspects of the making of the Indian world-class city and of this activist project of the state. And I'll give you one example, which is something called the India Poised campaign. I know it's hard to read this text, and so I'll share with you some of it. This is a branding campaign launched by the Times of India news group, and the idea is to brand India itself. The campaign pivots on the story of India versus India. One India straining at the leash, eager to spring forth and live up to all the adjectives the world has been showering recently upon us. The other India is the leash. An India whose faith in success is far greater than its fear of failure. An India that no longer boycotts foreign-made goods, but buys out the companies that makes them instead. One India, a tiny little voice at the back of the head, is looking down at the bottom of the ravine and hesitating. The other India is looking up at the sky and saying, it's time to fly. In the YouTube video that promotes the India Poised campaign, India's most famous Bollywood star, Amitabh Bachchan, is set in a curious landscape, an unfinished highway along the Arabian Sea. The construction site is reminiscent of the urban industrial edifices of modernization. Above all, it is devoid of people, of the messiness of those who may be in the way of development. But the making of the Indian world-class city also functions through the constant reference to other Asian models of development. My current work is on the so-called Asian world-class city. From Dubai to Dalian, cities across the continental swath of territory imagined as Asia are implicated in the making of global urban futures, world-class futures. And Asian cities constantly reference one another, revealing the citationary structure of global capitalism. Indeed, one can argue that worlding practices are inherently citationary. So India's special economic zones are explicitly modeled after those in China. And during the debate in Parliament in the launching of the Special Economic Zones Act, politicians in India repeatedly talked about how China was a shining example of a country that had developed through special economic zones. Or this, for example, these billboards line the streets of Delhi. They indicate an alliance between Dubai's largest real estate company, Emaar, and one of India's most important property firms, MGF. But note the reference point here. The reference is to the downtown Dubai project, at the heart of which is the Burj Dubai or Burj Khalifa Tower, which is the world's tallest building. And of course, the billboards read, Burj Dubai, the world's tallest tower. The only thing taller is our dream for India. Now, I also want to suggest that these citationary practices are fragile. And one example of this fragility is this reference itself. For those of you familiar with the Dubai story, you know that projects like this got that city-state into massive debt, $100 billion in debt. And the downtown Dubai project was completed only because the neighboring city-state of Abu Dhabi, rich in petrocapital, bailed this project out. It was a $10 billion bailout. And when the project opened, with a completed tower, that tower, the Burj Dubai, had been renamed the Burj Khalifa in reference to Sheikh Khalifa, the ruler of Abu Dhabi. Now, the practice of referencing Asia is not confined to the activist state. I'm interested in how these worlding practices are also the work of urban civil societies dominated by elite think tanks and middle-class associations that conjure up images of Dubai as a success story, or constantly in a city like Mumbai, Shanghai as a success story. It is thus that Bombay Fest, an organization of Mumbai's wealthy and powerful, endorsed the Vision Mumbai report and the attendant slum evictions. And it explicitly referenced Shanghai as a model of development. In fact, that process came to be known as the Shanghaification of Mumbai. In its material, Bombay First repeatedly talked about how what was at stake was a resurgent Asia, but that in 5 years it was possible to transform Mumbai into the next Shanghai, so that people would stop talking about Shanghai and Mumbai would become the talking point. Now, Bombay First celebrates Mumbai as a center of global finance. That's predictable. But it also tells a larger story about what it calls Asian entrepreneurialism. And one example of Asian entrepreneurialism for Bombay First is Mumbai's taxi drivers. So Bombay First, in its material, writes, the taxi driver, you don't need GPS with him around. He knows every nook and cranny of the city. This is Asian entrepreneurialism. I'm very interested in the making then, this diverse and multiple making of Asian world-class futures. And I want to make the point that much more is at work here than secessionary citizenship. The making of the Indian world-class city takes place through claims of integration, public interest, and urban democracy. It is not simply a retreat to gated enclaves, but in fact, it is a claim to urban life increasingly in the name of the middle-class consumer citizen. So in their work on the urban middle classes in India, Leela Fernandez and Patrick Heller note that such middle classes are distinct from those of the poor and working class interests. And they're also distinct from propertied classes. Yet organized as neighborhood associations and urban reform movements, the middle class has taken up the cause of the world-class city as the good city, what Amitabh Bhavishkar has called bourgeois environmentalism. Now, of course, the making of the world-class city is also subject to contestation. And for the last few years, I've been studying the ways in which the Indian world-class city, despite this great celebration of middle-class consumer citizenship, comes to be confronted, indeed encircled, by blockades. In 2006-2007, 2 uprisings, both in the Calcutta metropolitan region, which I've been studying for a while, presented a blockade to the Indian world-class city. One was Shingur, a site at the edge of Kolkata which was to house the Tata Corporation's flagship nanocar factory. Now, the nanocar is, of course, the world's cheapest automobile, meant to democratize automobility in India. To make way for this car factory, the left-front government had procured land from local peasants and sharecroppers, and it provided massive subsidies, geo-bribes, to use David Harvey's term, to the Tata Corporation. But here, opposition parties mobilized the displaced, and a few years later, the Tata Corporation abandoned the nanocar factory at Shingur. Similarly, at Nondigram, a village on the outskirts of the Calcutta metropolitan region, the left-front government tried to put into place a special economic zone modeled after those in China. In this case, village land was to be transformed into a chemical hub owned and operated by an Indonesian conglomerate. Here, a peasant uprising refused entry to the armed functionaries of the state, and despite brutal state repression, the peasant movement held its ground, becoming a cause for national anti-displacement movements. The Shingur and Nondigram barricades altered the landscape of electoral politics in the region, and the Left Front, just this month, is set to lose ground to opposition parties for the first time since 1977. But the blockade is also an unmaking of consent to the sign that is Asia. That today Indian politicians have to talk about how in India, in the world's largest democracy, Chinese-style development, instruments like special economic zones may not be appropriate because they have to deal with that messy thing called the people. And the blockade has also called into question key instruments of urban planning in India, from eminent domain to zoning. Let me give you one example. There was another blockade in Kolkata that existed for a while, which is embodied by a poignant symbol, quarter number 411, which you see down here. Occupied by Shambhu Prasad Singh, this factory quarter was the last holdout in a tract of factory lands that had been converted into the city's upscale South City retail and residential complex, the towers of which you see in the background here. The workers were evicted from their quarters with no prior notice and with meager compensation. One of them refused to make way. He was the blockade. He was eventually evicted, but his blockade triggered important scrutiny of the very nature of urban planning in Kolkata. Soon it became evident that the South City complex had been built in direct violation of environmental laws and through the enclosure of some of southern Kolkata's largest water bodies. Such forms of elite informality and elite illegality are commonplace in Indian cities today. And I'm very interested in how, while urban poverty is criminalized, elite informality is often legitimized and even practiced by the state. But for a moment at least, Shambhu Prasad Singh's blockade made visible the informality and illegality of the South City complex, and these towers came to be known as the Towers of Violation. Now, these are all examples of what, following Steve Graham, can be understood to be disrupted cities. These are also often efforts to forge alternative urban futures. In other words, these are counter-worlding practices. And there are many kinds of blockades. For me, one of the most intriguing is what is quite literally a standstill or a standing still. So in Kolkata, peri-urban condominium projects mark the aspirations of the Asian world-class city. These are ambitious public-private partnerships, and these are townships meant to serve the global Indian. But there are many, including the city's showpiece new town, that are ghost towns. Frozen in a state of incompletion, they lack urban services. Residents survive in the ways in which slum dwellers and squatters do in poor informal settlements, by buying water from vendors, using diesel generators, and making do with unpaved streets. Many are quickly moving out, abandoning that world-class future. I'm inspired here by a photographic exhibit titled Standing Still, the work of a Malaysian artist, Simran Gill, Gill, in her Standing Still exhibit, presents what she calls images of ambitious development projects abandoned before completion. They capture what Gill describes as a place in time. She writes, "A place in time where one might say the past lies in ruins, unkempt and untended, and the future has somehow been abandoned and has started to crumble. No way forward, no way back." Taken between 2000 and 2003 in Malaysia, Simran Gill's photographs interrupt the fantastic teleology that at that time was the East Asian miracle. These forms of standing still are instances of what Steve Graham has described as, I quote, "temporary ruins in the dreams of modernity, mobility, and circulation." But the blockades can also consolidate rather than erode the making of the Indian world-class city. In other words, counter-worlding may consolidate hegemonic worlding practices. And let me give you one example. In withdrawing from the nanocar factory at Shingur, Ratan Tata, CEO of the Tata Corporation, wrote an open letter to the people of West Bengal. In it, he explained the withdrawal as one where Tata's dream of building up industrial jobs in West Bengal had been shattered. And addressing the latter mainly to the youth of West Bengal, he told them that they faced a choice. They could choose jobs, modern infrastructure, rule of law, and prosperity, or they could choose what he called a destructive political environment of confrontation, agitation, violence, and lawlessness. Amidst a deindustrialized and informalized economy, Ratan Tata's open letter dangled that most rare of dreams: factory employment, industrial jobs. And so, after the Tata Corporation's departure from Shingur, a new round of protests took place at that site. I don't have photographs of it. This time by those who had relinquished land for the factory in the hope of factory jobs. Their banners read, "Welcome back, Ratan Tata. We want industry. We don't want confrontation." This too was a blockade, but this time in defense of industrialization. Amidst persistent structural violence, it's impossible to assert that the subaltern has consented to the wage slavery of the world-class city. Yet it is equally impossible to assert that industrialization and urbanization are elite interests simply imposed on the poor. Ratan Tata's open letter suggested that surely elsewhere in Asia, special economic zones were possible. Surely elsewhere in Asia, the fires of protest were not burning, a world was in formation, urban futures were being made. After pulling out of Shingur, the Tata Corporation relocated its nanocar factory to Sanand, a town on the outskirts of the Ahmedabad metropolitan region in Gujarat. The Gujarat government had provided ample geo-bribes for the relocation, including 1,200 acres of free prime land. But more was at stake than the evasion of the blockade erected at Kolkata. The Chief Minister of Gujarat that you see here in this, really out of focus image, Narendra Modi, is always eager to put on the show that Gujarat is open for business. But he is also the architect of the 2002 riots waged against Muslims. Carefully planned and implemented by the instruments of the state, the Gujarat pogroms killed and maimed hundreds of Muslims. So today it is Modi who is the keeper of the dream image of Indian Swadeshi prosperity, the nanocar. And it is thus that the nanocar stands at the confluence of Hindu fundamentalism and neoliberal nationalism. This fascist utopia, which Renu Desai has written quite a bit about, is also a worlding practice. Let me turn briefly to my two other examples, one of them being the worlding practices of the global periphery. I've repeatedly suggested that the worlding city is not just an elite project, but it is also a mass dream, including the mass dream of neoliberalism or of Hindu fundamentalism. It is necessary, therefore, to understand how global peripheries are also sites of worlding. And here I draw upon the work of Abdulmalik Simone. In outlining the worlding of African cities, Simone talks about worlding from below. In other words, that worlding is much more than the control of world economic functions. It is also the transactions of those most marginal from these economic capacities. It is the diverse engagement of those who've been cast out into the world. In more recent work, Simone draws attention to the periphery as a space in between that has never really been brought fully under the auspices of the logic and development trajectories that characterize a center. In what ways are global peripheries sites of worlding from below? It is a question worth posing of a periphery that often garners international attention. The southern suburbs of Beirut, Al-Dahir, or the Shia ghetto. Here, the de facto state is Hezbollah, the party of God, a religious militia that has matured into one of Lebanon's most important political parties. Al-Dahir is the space of what Hezbollah calls the resistance society, where poor, downtrodden Shia can create an autonomous urbanism. And indeed, with this in mind, Hezbollah has built up an infrastructure of urbanism and development that defies the logic of the center and defies intervention by the Lebanese state. From schools to health clinics to microfinance institutions to Jihad al-Bina or Jihad for construction, Hezbollah's neighborhood Al-Dahir demonstrates how the periphery is, to borrow a phrase from Simone, a potentially generative space, a source of innovation and adaptation. But this is also where I part company with Simone. For Simone, the periphery is potentially destabilizing of the center. Its logic is that which cannot be brought under the auspices of the center. Let me suggest that cases like Al-Dahir remind us that the periphery also consolidates the logic of the center. Hezbollah is an insurgent militia forging a resistant society. But it is also, as Mona Harb, Hiba Bouakar and others have shown, a real estate developer. It produces urban space. In this guise, Hezbollah supports and implements projects of urban development that can transform Al-Dahir, the Shia ghetto, into a city center worthy of a global city. Hezbollah explicitly frames the issue of urban renewal as one of the modernization of space, linking it closely to the imperative of development, of progress for the Shia. The language used by Hezbollah is that of tamaddun, or civilization. It's a word that derives from the term Medina, which in Arabic means both city and civilization. This is the equivalent of city as civitas, not in the sense of citizenship, but in the sense of modernization. In Hezbollah's resistant society, no resistance is possible to the making of urban futures. No resistance is possible to a global neoliberalism manifested in world-class cities, a vision that Hezbollah fully endorses. I would argue then that it's crucial that we view global peripheries like Al-Dahir as sites of worlding practices, and that we pay critical attention to how they have been worlded in the geographies of our theory. But it would also be a mistake to see these practices as forms of counter-worlding that are necessarily destabilizing of dominant logics of capital. Indeed, it's equally misleading to use the language of worlding from below, in this case, because what is the below in the Hezbollah example? Its resistant society is grounded on the one hand in an urban neighborhood, in a periphery, the Shia ghetto, but Hezbollah is also embedded in circulations of global finance, including the wealth of a Shia diaspora. These are latitudes of hegemony that cannot be reduced to an above or below. They indicate the multiple projects of worlding through which cities are constituted, and it's partly why in the Worlding Cities book, Iwa and I repeatedly call for a latitudinal analysis of global urbanism. All right, for my final site, I will return home to America and to the idea of third worlding the West. I borrow that phrase, third worlding, from a now old piece by Kristen Koptiuch. That piece argues the third world is a concept metaphor to gloss a new practice of othering in the US, not in order to collapse what are distinctly different historical formations, but as a reminder that the third world is a name, a representation, not a place. It specifically names the effect of a process of exploitative incorporation and hegemonic domination and its fierce contestation by subjugated peoples that used to take place at a safe, reassuring distance. With that idea of third worlding the West, I want to turn to a very particular political moment in the US. As you all perhaps know, last year, the state of Arizona passed a law targeting undocumented immigrants, or what Arizona called illegal aliens, seeking to achieve, quote, attrition through enforcement. The law should be of interest to all urban planners because it's titled Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act. What is at stake is much more than the criminalization of undocumented immigrants. It is the desubjectivation of racial ethnic minorities. What is at stake is the difficult answer to Nancy Fraser's important ethical question, who counts as the subject of justice? The Arizona law is a blatant example of what, following Steve Graham, we can understand to be military urbanism. It is part of a larger technosocial formation through which homeland cities are being reconfigured as national security spaces, and it is the making of all urban spaces as global borders. It is a remaking of that unbearable existence documented by Gloria Anzaldúa. In her language, it is the site at which the third world grates against the first and bleeds. In the face of such third worlding, is a counterworld possible? For this, I turn to a set of architects and artists who work at and disrupt the global border. Theirs is the work that stretches across and beyond national boundaries, and it is this critical transnationalism that I present to you as a final instance of worlding and counterworlding. Take, for example, architect Teddy Cruz, who, along with the community organization Casa Familiar, has sought to create what he calls living rooms at the border. In his design practice, Cruz tries to transform the San Diego-Tijuana border, which is the most trafficked checkpoint in the world, into the urban laboratory of the 21st century. Global borders and border neighborhoods are, according to Cruz, the paradigmatic, out-of-place places of the 21st century. And he's interested in whether or not new notions of architectural form can emerge out of these social formations, but can also enact what he calls an urban acupuncture on these border neighborhoods and spaces. An urban acupuncture that can subvert the alliance between militarization and urbanization. Now, I want to point out that this transnational divide, the sort of social legislation of fear that we're seeing in Arizona, is not new. Urban historian Dolores Hayden, writing in the context of Los Angeles, has documented the enduring theme in the American West, that is the loss of territory, of how at different historical moments, different social groups have lost the right to live in the city. From African Americans bound by slavery and later in red line ghettos, to Mexican Americans repatriated to Mexico during the Great Depression, to Chinese Americans governed by exclusion laws, to Japanese Americans interned during the Second World War. I'm interested, and I borrow here a term from the Chicana theorist Sheila Sandoval, in the technologies of crossing that can disrupt the social legislation of fear and thus disrupt the securitization of space. Take, for example, the work of a quite controversial group in the US, the Electronic Disturbance Theater, co-founded by visual artist Ricardo Dominguez. The group's experiment is quite literally a technology of crossing. It's called a Trans-Border Immigrant Tool, and it augments low-cost cell phones with locative media like GPS, such that undocumented immigrants can find safe routes, shelter, food, and water. It is thus that the technologies devised to facilitate automobility are being redeployed to make possible a different kind of navigation, the navigation of militarized transnational space by desubjectivated non-citizens. Such ruptures, or urban acupuncture, are also evident in the work of the transnational art project Insight. Taking place at various venues along the San Diego-Tijuana border, Insight performs transient art in places where art is usually not exhibited. Each performance weaves a new transnational fabric of meaning and habitation. I'll give you one example. In 1997, Marcos Ramirez Ere, a Tijuana artist, rolled an enormous two-headed Trojan horse into the middle of traffic waiting to cross the US-Mexico border. The horse appeared seemingly out of nowhere, straddled the border with two legs resting on the US side, two legs on the Mexico side. One head looked north, the other looked south, and after a while it vanished. Ere's arc of work turns the border into what he calls culture, where a doubling of identity is possible, and thus perhaps the two-headed horse. He writes, "Instead of feeling half Mexican and half American, I feel double." Terry Crews writes of Ere's Trojan horse. Ere inserted his horse into the decentered, deterritorialized, and multi-directional flows that constitute the border, where it dwelt for a brief moment, impossibly occupying both sides at once, in defiance of the dialectic forces that govern this space. The Trojan horse was the fragile anti-monument. It reminds us that the contemporary city is still able to elude the absolute ordering devices that attempt to render it homogeneous and one-dimensional, that the most derelict and unexpected places have the potential to become sites for light occupations that challenge the massive colonization of traditional urbanism. These artistic interventions recreate global borders and walls as a public sphere, what Ye, in a recent piece in Public Culture, calls the public at the line. The line in this case is the border, but it is also la linea, a bilingual phrase that refers to the border condition and its impossible ontologies. For one who dwells here, the meaning of the border may be condensed to this point: the line, prohibition, and passage, a confrontation, the perpetually repeated surrender of oneself and one's documents. This is a counterworld. It emerges from the practice of seeing from the south. It turns third world spaces into Trojan horses. It turns global borders into technologies of crossing. Most important, it defies the waiting room of history to which for so long the urbanism of the global south has been consigned. Thank you.